Hello, it's Alistair Curry here for CPD On Demand, and today we're talking to Uwe Putlitz, the CEO of JBCC, which stands for the Joint Building Contracts Committee. Welcome, Uwe.
Good afternoon. Nice to be here.
Thank you. So, Uwe, you're a man of vast experience, a professional architect, a professional construction project manager. What brought you to the JBCC?
That's a difficult one. I've always enjoyed the building industry, but I've also found it interesting to look at how it happens behind the scenes and what happens when things don't work the way they should.
Okay.
And to some extent, that's of course where contracts come in, how they need to be administered and how they need to be used correctly to try and regulate and avoid disputes later on.
Okay, and it's a big association. Perhaps you could just explain how the constituents all came together.
The history goes back of contracts, and I think we need to look at the history for a while. That in the 1870s, the Royal Institute of British Architects, together with the master builders in London, as far as we can establish, wrote the very first standard form of building contract.
Right.
And that pattern has sort of been retained over the years. South Africa copied that system in the 60s or thereabouts, when we were known as a joint study group.
Okay.
The joint study group. And that fell apart after a while because various people weren't there anymore, so a lot of these things depend on personalities and somebody's got the drive and the interest. That was then reconstituted as a joint building contracts committee, and in fact that functioned for 5 or 6 years and then became a not-for-profit company.
Okay.
And now in 2018 it's our 21st year as a not-for-profit company publishing building contracts.
Right.
Now we are unique in that respect. We're a not-for-profit company. We don't have shareholders, but we do have 9 constituents that represent the industry. So that includes, on the client side, SAPOA, who represent building developers and owners. On the contractor side, the master builders and the very specialist subcontract associations, and somewhere in that sandwich are the architects, engineers, the landscape architects, the quantity surveyors and the project managers. And they all have a say in what is put into the committee, into the various contracts, based on the experience that people have had, what works, what doesn't work, and so on. But having said that, although it is a South African product, we of course are acutely aware of other contracts in the world. Building contracts are over 100 years old. They've been used all over the world with different sorts of experience and good and not so good things. And we've tried to distill something that is fairly easy to use, written in simple English that anybody can understand and use it. Right. And to try and make it as compact and user-friendly as possible.
Okay. Well, Uwe, that's great. Thanks for the background. I mean, contracts are binding, and today's discussion is on dispute resolution. In fact, how to essentially avoid possible pitfalls. And so if we start with dispute avoidance, what is the first starting point when entering into a contract? What should the person undertake to do?
Let's just go sideways for a moment. In South Africa, we use 4 forms of contract that have been approved by the Construction Industry Development Board, being the GCC, the NEC and the FEDIC documents, and the JBCC agreement. And all 4 of them have got dispute resolution clauses in some form or another. But the first prize is not to get to a dispute, because dispute resolution means you've got to take time outside your normal working hours to now solve these things. So it's taking away from your productive time. And that doesn't do anybody any good. It doesn't solve the project any quicker, and it costs money and it costs lots of nerves. So what we'd prefer to try and achieve is that we avoid disputes in the first instance. And that starts long before we sign a contract, because there are different types of contract, and the building contract as we've got it at the moment may not necessarily be the best option. Okay. Depending on the nature of what the client requires. And this is where potentially the problem starts, is that the art client doesn't actually know what they want. And that's putting it quite generally. Right. But you need to have a brief. You need to understand the scope of that project in detail. And if you leave information out, that is where potential disputes come from later on, because now you're changing the parameters under which the contract is tendered, and it changes the time frame, it changes the cost and all that sort of thing. So to go and write a brief in detail and to try and understand the environment in which you're working, the risks that are associated with it, and then human nature is generally that we're all very optimistic that we can do this type of project in a certain time for a certain amount of money. It usually isn't like that.
Right. So again, it's about the intent, but you mentioned the attitude to succeed. What did you mean by that?
Well, why would we go and enter into a project? Because we want a certain product, and we want it preferably without too much drama. Especially when you're now talking of larger firms where you often work together. Firm A and Firm B might have built up a very good relationship, be it the consultants or the contractors or the clients and the consultants or the clients and whoever in the team. But now somebody changes in one or both of those firms. And all of a sudden that relationship that has worked well for years doesn't work because there's a personality clash. And that is something that needs to be managed. In fact, there's some international research work that personality clashes account for between 20 and 30% of disputes. And that is usually quite easy, that if that becomes obvious that you can replace one or two people and solve that problem.
Yes.
But a lot of the problem really relates to understanding the nature of the product and the environment in which you're working. And here it is also very important that we understand who the stakeholders are. And the stakeholders are not necessarily just the neighbors, but it is your suppliers, it's your customers, it's where your staff come from. How do they get there? Have you got access for those people? Does your brief have to include feeding your staff because you're far away from wherever people live?
Yes.
All of those things need to be considered. The building contract might not cover some of those things, but the project does. That you actually now have a successful whole that hopefully earns a good return for the investor.
Goodness. Yes. But with the best intentions in the world, if things do go wrong, what are the next steps?
Well, can we talk to one another? And that is maybe the simplest option, that if we're not too sure what or why it's happened, that we can go and say, let's go and meet in the pub after work. Tell me what your problem is. What have I done wrong? What have you done wrong? How can we solve that?
Yes.
And with a bit of luck, maybe after the second beer, we can pull up a serviette and say either what not and you, the whoever. We now agree that we're going to solve that. And as long as there are no police outside, have a third beer and shake hands and carry on.
Yes.
That would be first prize, and that we do talk to one another when something doesn't work, if we haven't got the information, if we can't do something, that there's more rock on site than we anticipated or whatever. Let's solve it. There must be a solution.
Right.
And the solution isn't that you say, I want to go and claim things. Can't we talk about it when we find the problem?
Okay, so that, of course, is the mediation side of it, I would say. Is that correct? How would you define it as such?
At this stage, it's still a communication
Still a communication.
thing. When things go wrong, we'll have to find out how can we best solve it. And that would be the process where we now have to go and find a solution together.
Okay.
And
so it hasn't worked out, and then you both agreed we need to talk to a third party.
And that third party should be somebody who's not involved with the project at this stage, because you're likely to have a bias one way or the other. And mediators are trained and they're available in this country, throughout the country, that you've got to go and say, this is the nature of the dispute. Nature being, is it money, is it technical or political or whatever that matter might be. And that person must try and get the two parties, like we're sitting together now, to explain what is your problem, what is my problem. And that you can encourage the people to go and say, how would you like to solve it? What are you trying to get out of this?
Yes.
And if necessary, you might have to break into separate private sessions to find out what hidden agendas there might be, which of course you won't talk about. But essentially these things can be done very quickly, relatively cheaply, but you do need to have a trained mediator, and that you don't disrupt the work process. You don't go to the next more sophisticated dispute resolution process, because all of a sudden what should be solved in a day or two now becomes a month or two before you can even get near a solution.
So what sort of qualification does a mediator require? Is there a license, for example?
Theoretically, at this stage, none.
Mm-hmm.
But if you talk to the various bodies like the Association of Arbitrators, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, and so on, they all run courses in mediation.
Okay.
But there's no statutory requirement at this stage, nor is there a statutory requirement to be an adjudicator or an arbitrator, unfortunately.
Okay.
And unfortunately, a lot of people have thought this is a wonderful way of earning a bit of extra money. And some of those results haven't been so wonderful. But there are an awful lot of people who are very competent in this country and have resolved a lot of things relatively quickly, relatively inexpensively by using the expertise.
Okay. So mediation and arbitration, what's the key difference?
Mediation, there's an outsider who's a mediator, but it's a totally private affair.
Okay.
You sit in a boardroom or in a restaurant if that's what you'd like to do, and it's a short period of time, and the charges are really limited to that person who's got to play the role of a mediator. Right. The next most sophisticated route is to go to adjudication. And in adjudication, we follow in South Africa the English rules, where you determine what the rules are, which we publish, they're available on our website.
Okay.
And they define what the adjudicator can do and can't do and what procedures he needs to follow. Simplistically, the parties need to agree who the adjudicator is, and that adjudicator would generally be nominated by a body like the Association of Arbitrators, RICS, Arbitration Federation, and so on. And you would then explain to that association where you're located, and it's obviously more difficult if you're located in Umtata or Johannesburg to find somebody who's a geotechnical specialist or an acoustic specialist,
of course,
or whatever. So you would like to try and find somebody who can deal with the nature of this dispute as soon as possible.
Right.
The adjudication rules have been written around a 20 working day period.
Okay.
That the adjudicator needs to come up with an award in that period, or he doesn't get paid, which is quite a good incentive to try and get it done.
I would think so.
The whole idea is that this is a quick, rough and ready process. It becomes immediately binding on the two parties. But if somebody feels seriously aggrieved, they can now give notice of dissatisfaction.
Okay.
And it could relate to that maybe the adjudicator didn't do his work, in which case you might have to get another adjudicator to sort it out, or maybe the original adjudicator needs to fix it. Or you might go and say, I would like to now go to a more sophisticated process like arbitration.
Okay.
And arbitration largely follows court rules, so it now becomes quite a intensive route. There's lots of paper and lots of procedures that had to be followed, and of course with that the price goes up.
Yes.
And as does the duration. The idea is still that it is relatively private, but you now involve expert witnesses and all sorts of things, whereas in the others there are no witnesses normally. And if you've got witnesses, of course you can play games. If you've got a bit of spare cash, then you get a witness who says so-and-so, then your next witness is, no, I don't agree. And then with two views, you probably need a third witness who probably doesn't agree with the first two witnesses. And that, of course, now becomes an expensive pastime.
Very much so.
And you can do that in arbitration, and you can play that game in litigation.
All right.
But where you're dealing with, in adjudication, probably in the 20, 50,000 category, depending on the complexity, you're unlikely to get much change in an arbitration under 100,000 rands, but it could run into 1 million rands. If you want to go to litigation, you've now got to go and give notice of these things. You've got to appoint your legal team. You're unlikely to get a court date in under 3 years, if you're lucky these days. And by that stage, you probably spend easily 3 million rands just to get to court, and you haven't even solved your problem yet. So we would like to encourage people not to go to the serious forms of litigation and so on, but that you actually go and communicate and use the simple processes where there's only one person involved and it's private. And of course the other problem was going to court. It's now all open in the public eye. You want to be there.
No, I think reputation is a pretty important thing to protect.
To preserve,
and
absolutely.
Preserve, yes. So when it comes to things like expert determination, where does that fit in?
It's something that's not often used in this country. It's something that you can do. It's been used quite a lot in the UK. And going back to mediation, you may get to a situation where the two parties sort of look at one another and say, yeah, that's fine. Now what do we do? So it's not that both parties have agreed to this solution. I don't know what's stopping them agreeing, but they can then go and say to the mediator, you've heard the story from both sides. What would you think we should do? And the mediator then has the role to play, if he wants to say, okay, for a small additional fee, because after all you're using my expertise, I would suggest, based on what you've told me, that you consider doing that, that and that, but it still remains your decision to implement that. But that is simplistically expert determination, and it must be based on an agreement by the parties to go that route.
It's always an unhappy situation when that occurs. What about price? I mean, are people entering into contracts without thinking sometimes because they need the work? I mean, what are the sort of common misunderstandings? I mean, there are forms of contract which you alluded to earlier which do provide good guidelines. So
I think all of those occur. A particularly bad example, of course, is subcontractors.
Okay.
That the main contractors find the work, which is usually a bit easier for them than for the subcontractors. But big contractors rely on subcontractors because they offer a specialized service, whatever that may be. And they very often don't appoint them the correct way, and they usually don't pay them. And it doesn't matter who you are, no money, no cash flow, you're not going to survive in business.
Of course.
And the big problem is usually that subcontractors don't get paid, or they don't get paid in full. And because they don't get appointed on a subcontract agreement, and all the big agreements have got subcontract agreements as well, which are usually not used. And certainly our experience is that you get a letter as a subcontractor that you're appointed in terms of, and by the way, the following clauses don't apply. And of course, the clauses that don't apply are all the subcontractor's rights. That he's got no recourse if he doesn't get paid, that he's not entitled to an extension of time or any of those sort of things that are removed. And of course, that's totally immoral, not to say illegal.
So it comes down to defining the scope.
Absolutely. And of defining it accurately.
Accurately.
Because the other problem is that every now and then, and I don't really want to say that too loud, but it often happens in state contracts, that you start off with one thing and say, oops, no, we actually forgot that. We need to add a this and we need to add a that, which means now all your original parameters for that contract fall away. And then the problem is that, particularly if you're talking about organs of state, they budget for a particular year, financial year. You change the scope of work, now the budget doesn't fit into the financial years anymore. And then you run out of money, and then you don't finish the job. And then there's no service delivery.
Well, and so it unravels from there. So essentially you have to know what you want, but then as these various discussions go on, mediation, arbitration, as you said, the clock is ticking, there's a contract that has to be completed. So can we talk about time and cost? What are the broad issues that need to be highlighted in terms of contracts?
Well, we normally assume that a contract can be done in a certain period of time for a certain cost, and for that we need to have the right sort of documentation, bills of quantities and all that sort of thing, and a program. And the program isn't what you do in the old days on the back of a cigarette box. It actually needs to be sorted out quite properly using the right sort of software. Obviously, if you want to, you can draw it on a piece of paper. It still works. But if you use the recognized forms of software like MS Project and Primavera, you can go and program the work quite accurately based on experience. And you can, of course, go and hide things in there that nobody finds unless they're also good at programming. That you allow a bit of extra time where you shouldn't have. It's like contractors usually allow a bit more concrete for the foundations because they know that they never measured accurately because you can't see what's going underground. But you need to have a program that is realistic, that is worked out based on the relationships of which trade needs to come first and second. It sometimes becomes more difficult if they did different sections of the work. Can you do work on this side of the project and on that side of the project simultaneously? Or if this doesn't work, is that also being delayed? So the project needs to be programmed very carefully in the right sequence. It's very unlikely that if there's any change, that you can accommodate that within the original time.
Okay.
But not impossible. Very unlikely though. But by changing the sequence of doing things, maybe it won't be a delay to the project. But I've yet to see one of those happen in practice. So time is the one side. Why would you want, or why would there be delays? Could be any number of reasons. Could be climatic factors, could be statutory things, could be force majeure items, strikes, rights, those sort of things. Or that you don't have any information to do the work. Or the site might not have been handed over to the contractor when it should have been handed over. Or there's a whole string of lates. Late instructions, late appointment of another consultant, late appointment of a subcontractor. All of those things contribute to delays. Simplistically, for the contractor to be entitled to be given more time, the employer must be at fault.
Right.
If the contractor is at fault, obviously can't benefit from his own misdemeanors. And usually when there's an extension of time, there's money involved. Not always, not with every category of it, but generally yes. I think maybe we need to just get back to one thing, and that is the climatic circumstances where you're entitled to an extension of time. Traditionally, we used to refer to, you need to have statistics of the Weather Bureau, wherever the site is and all the rest of it, which doesn't do any harm, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything. I don't really want to get into the climate change debate, but if you take a silly example, working on the Highveld, and you get 50 millimeters of rain in the middle of July, and in the old days we'd refer to the department of whatever it was called, the Weather Bureau, to say, so how much rain have we had in July in Johannesburg? And you probably find that maybe we've had 50 millimeters once in 200 years. Does that mean the contractor's not entitled to an extension of time? Well, what work was he doing at that time? If he was trying to dig foundations and the site is flooded, the statistics are actually irrelevant. He can't work.
Yes.
But if that building is waterproof, well, it's got a roof on it, and we now discover there's a leak. He might have been doing us a favor, but that doesn't mean he gets an extension of time. So we normally try and explain to people that the question is, can the contractor work or can't you work? And it's not only rain. If you're working at the coast, there's usually a lot of wind. If you work in certain parts of the country where the temperature routinely gets above 40 or 50 degrees, like Uppington, not a good time to pour concrete. It'll never work.
No.
And you can't go and pour concrete too well at minus 10 degrees in Sutherland. So if the contractor can't work, then he must be given time to go and work. And he must be compensated for that, because he's still got the running costs of keeping the site going and all the rest of it at that stage.
And this is all about the risk management and risk acceptance side of it.
Yeah, and some of these become the employer's risk. Some of them might be the contractor's risk. Contractor's risk are usually that his staff don't do, or subcontractors don't do what they should be doing. The employer's risk is that things outside the contract happen. And that's why the contractor would have to be compensated for those.
Right.
Which is where NEC uses that terminology of a compensation event, which is quite a good descriptive term.
All right. It sounds like a good one. Of course, then people skimp on costs. I think an example would be not employing a fully competent professional team. Clearly that's a mistake.
Yes. It depends on the nature of the project. And there are two problems. The one type of skill that often doesn't get appointed on time is an acoustics engineer. Depends on the nature of the project. Is a speculative building, or do you know what the tenants require? And quite often, if it's a speculative thing, and one of the tenants now wants to have a radio studio in a building, how do you go and create a sound isolated box within an existing structure? And it gets even worse depending on the type of structure you use, that you can't make holes in slabs. You can't add a floating floor slab on top of an existing slab because it was never designed for that load. Then you end up with very strange spaces that you've got steps all over the place to go and have this box, but you need to isolate it, and you need to go and have space for the air conditioning ducts to fit in, and they don't fit in, and then it doesn't become a happy solution.
No.
The other problem is that we're often told that professional fees are too high, that the project is no longer feasible. And if a project depends on the fees being too high, then there's something wrong with the feasibility. okay, maybe we shouldn't generalize too much. If the fees were, say, 30% of the project cost, that would probably be unrealistic. But if the difference is between 10 and 11%, that 1% makes a difference that the project's not feasible, doesn't make sense. The other problem that happens quite often these days, because there are no recognized fee scales anymore, recommended fee scales, that it's an open market scenario, that some people are quoting 20 or 30% of what used to be the recommended fee scale. And there's no ways you can run a business on that basis. Projects that become more complex by and large, that often requires more documentation and more details than before.
Right.
If you haven't got the money, you're not going to produce that sort of documentation. And if the information isn't there for the contractor, you will have more questions from site, how do I do this? Or that you come to site and say, what the hell have you done here? Demolish because it's not right. But you've never told the contractor how to do it properly. And with that comes the other problem, and it applies equally to things like Excel spreadsheet and Word documents and drawings, that you copy things from previous documentation, but you don't check that you've now got a few cells left out or added in an Excel spreadsheet, or you've got details from another drawing that are at a different scale or they don't quite apply. And of course those...
Just a small error can become very costly.
A magnificent mess.
Yes, so as you're saying, when it comes to documentation, particularly when it comes to bills of quantity, plans, updated plans, it's very important to keep a paper trail. Obviously you have to check and make sure that all the data is carried across, but what about in the normal project management process?
Well, there are a couple of aspects. You need to keep track of drawings, you need to know what was issued when, and you need to make sure that the current edition is actually used, not an outdated one. The usual trick, of course, is that you eat your lunch on the new drawings and build to the old drawings.
Yes.
That's what you try to avoid. You also need to record things. And if something happens on site, with all the technology we've got these days, it's quite easy to send a notice to everybody involved to say, on so-and-so date, on this site, on this floor, this or that happened, whatever it is. And that somebody can go and write back and say, don't do anything until we've looked at it, or protect it, or do this. So it's important to record events, because sooner or later that becomes a claim, and you now need to know what happened, where did it happen, when did it happen, what effect did it have immediately, long-term effect, did it delay other things, and maybe more important, did anybody get hurt, for instance, because all those things become critical. And of course, if somebody gets hurt, you need to stop the work and ambulances and report to Department of Labour and police and all of those sort of things. The other thing that you need to do very carefully is have minutes of meetings. And minutes of meetings are not unlike a board meeting. They have legal status. They need to be written properly, that you record the events that have happened or not happened and questions and so on. You don't have to write a novel, but certainly you need to record decisions or progress, whatever the case may be. And you have to be the judge if you're the chairman of that meeting. If you see a problem brewing, that you can see the one is agitating about something or other and the other is not happy, then it may be important to record to say that the employer stated that, that and that, and the contractor reported that he couldn't or wouldn't or whatever. Because you don't have any clarity there. Because the next thing is, if this does become a dispute, where are you going to go? And you're going to look at the minutes, and you're going to look at instructions that might have been issued on the job. Those are the sort of two records usually that you'd look to. So those need to be done properly. You also need to make sure that at the next meeting the minutes are approved, and that you have some wording to say the minutes of so-and-so date or whatever were approved without correction or subject to item whatever, reading 10 days, not 5 days, whatever the case may be. They should be signed. The theory is ideally between the employer and the contractor, that they should both sign because they're both party to the contract. That, of course, is usually a bit unrealistic. So you normally settle for the chairman of the meeting to sign them as a record. The other point, of course, is now you've got all of these minutes and you've got the bits of paper that say we've issued drawings and bills or whatever the case may be, and something goes wrong. Can you find that information? And if it were to go all the way to involving lawyers, that becomes the most expensive fine clerk you could find.
Mm.
If you now present that person with a wheelbarrow full of paper,
Yes.
and the lawyer needs to go and say, no, these were problems, these were minutes, these were photographs, and he's got to file those according to some other system. So you need to make sure that you have information in a way that can be found and retrieved, and that they're keywords or something that can help you find information if you need to. And if it gets into a dispute scenario, it doesn't matter which version, if you haven't got information, you haven't got a dispute. How are you going to defend yourself?
And presumably a lot of the disputes come down to defects and liabilities.
Usually, yes. It sometimes starts with poor documentation, which is one type of thing where the usual example I quote is the floor. If you don't specify how flat the floor has got to be, then a commercially accepted standard must be acceptable. But that floor is not going to be flat. And if, for argument's sake, you use that room as a training room with a video camera on wheels, your picture would jump all over the place because that floor is not flat. But if you needed that, then you would have had to specify it, and it obviously cost more money to get a floor to that degree of flatness.
Right.
But you can't now come back after the event and say, contractor, you didn't do your work because you never specified it. So that's the one side of defects. The other one is simply that we've got some very good artisans in this country, and we've got some who are not so good.
Okay.
And a contractor is really under an obligation to make sure that he delivers a project under the standards that the industry would be proud of. And that doesn't require the principal agent or project manager to tell him what the standards are. The contractor needs to actually know that and not invite the professional team or the employer to come to site when the work is not up to standard. And if you take, I don't know, what's a good example, a cornice, and that the cornice in the room is made up out of a whole lot of scrap pieces that don't tie up, you don't need anybody to tell you that that's not good workmanship.
And who should actually be doing this job, in your opinion? The person of recording all this? Is it a commercial manager's job to do this? Is there a special level of training required? Some sort of legal awareness, surely?
No, generally, traditionally, when we started with standard form of contracts, it used to be the architect who did everything.
Okay.
As times have changed and skills have become more specialized, in many countries we've ended up with an animal called the principal agent and or a project manager, as distinct from the engineer and the architect. They usually have that sort of background, sometimes quantity surveyors, but it's usually the technical background, and that the architect and engineer do the design work, which might be coordinated by another specialist, a principal consultant who's quite often necessary on more complex projects to make sure you don't have fire sprinklers coming out of light fittings, slightly exaggerated.
But even so.
Similar things have happened. So it should really be somebody with that knowledge. And very often, I hate to say this of my own profession, but some architects are very good at design, but they haven't got the faintest idea how to manage and execute a job. And this is where you need to have the technical skills to know what is buildable, as distinct from what looks nice.
Sure.
The ability to deal with people and the managerial ability to go and run the job and to administer it, because it takes an enormous amount of time to go and do all the administration of a contract. It's not something you do in your spare time.
No.
And
it's a very specialized job.
It includes the finding side of all the information as well.
And so when you're the professional person on site, I mean, what's the recommendation? You can see there's a problem. Before it goes to the meeting, what are the steps that can be taken?
Well, hopefully that somebody alerts you to it if you haven't seen it already, and that you discuss it and say, okay, I understand the problem. What caused the problem? Is it a supplier? Is it something else that's gone wrong, lack of information, wrong specification, something climatic that is something, whatever. Now that we understand it, how do we fix it?
Right.
And once we've understood that, is there anybody to blame? Maybe there isn't, maybe there is. And one of the difficulties very often where the architect is now the principal agent as well, and he might have been the naughty one by not issuing the right information timeously. he needs to now adjudicate a claim from the contractor which says, I need more time to fix it and it's going to cost more money. Now, is the architect going to say, sorry, my mistake, I've got to award that because the contractors actually deserved all of that, or we're now going to try and sweep this under the carpet? And we can't sweep it under the carpet because it's a contractual obligation. But this is where we need to go and talk, for instance, to your professional indemnity insurer, and that's one reason why we have PI insurance, to say we've made a mistake, not in public, it's like admitting liability in a motor accident, to say we've had this problem, how do we best solve it?
Right.
And the PI insurance guys are very good because they don't really want to pay big claims, but if we can solve it, and maybe if they attach you to a competent construction lawyer, we can sort out how we deal with this and how it gets paid for. But you can't deprive somebody of a justified award.
No, that's a very good comment. So, Uwe, in conclusion, what would you say to companies, small or large, entering into contracts? What's the first step, and what should they always do before signing on the dotted line?
You need to make sure that you understand the documentation that's presented at the time of tender. A contractor must go and exercise his expertise to go and look at what he's been given, but he must also go and say, as an expert in this field, there's something missing, because that becomes his risk ultimately. Because if he hasn't spotted it and he's now held responsible or accountable for doing what he didn't see, he might have to pay for it out of his own pocket, and after that to keep records in a way that you can find them again.
So Uwe, it's such a non-question in a way, but I have to ask it. I mean, what are the pitfalls of verbal contracts, and do people ever enter into these things?
If you look at the definition of a contract in the Oxford Dictionary, it says it's a spoken or a verbal agreement between two parties. The difficulty with the verbal bit is, I distinctly remember saying to you that this wall must be painted egg yellow, and you agreed with that at the time, at least you didn't say anything to the contrary, and then we painted egg yellow, and then you come and look at it and say, but that's not egg yellow. And I said, but it is. But you don't realize that I'm colorblind or you colorblind, doesn't really matter.
Yes.
But you didn't give me a color code of what that particular color should be, so you're not specific. Or you might have said you wanted polka dots on it, and I didn't hear polka dots, I thought you wanted circles. And the difficulty is, if you've said something, we don't have a full recollection of what we said. It is usually incomplete in some form or another. And when it gets challenged, you might have said this, but when you're thinking about it and you said, oh, by the way, it should have had stripes this way, which I never mentioned, and you should have covered the windowsill at the same time. And you now add things that were never there. And that is not an acceptable way of dealing with contracts and law, because it's open-ended and it's unenforceable. The only time a verbal contract works is if you buy shares from a broker to say, I want 100 whatnot contractor at around a share. There's no argument about the delivery time, about the cost, and as soon as you've transferred the money across, that transaction is complete. That's the only time a verbal contract works.
All right.
But not in the building industry.
And just slightly away from that, but is an SMS or an email acceptable?
In terms of the Electronic Communications and Transactions Act, yes.
Okay.
Any form of electronic communication is acceptable. That includes tweets and other things.
All right.
Although, for various reasons, we don't like those. If I say we, that's also the industry as a whole. You can certainly go and send an SMS in whatever it is, 166 characters or so. But if you want to go to court later on in 5 years' time, and you can retrieve any electronic communication, but you may have to get a court order to retrieve it from the various service providers. But in that space, can you now go and say who it was sent from, who it was sent to, on what project, what the problem was, in that number of characters. So Public Works particularly have emphasized that they will only accept communication in the form of an email.
Okay.
There's an example of an architect out of town who's used WhatsApp groups successfully, and that works quite well because you can attach minutes and photographs and all that to WhatsApp. So as a facilitator, WhatsApp is an acceptable way of dealing with it. But tweets and the like we're not too keen on.
No.
But they're not illegal, unfortunately. But
Right.
I think the important thing is you've got to specify in a contract that you will
Yes.
not accept tweets, unless you're working in the United States, maybe.
And you can print emails and file them and so
Absolutely, absolutely.
So, through all these interesting discussions, it's very clear that a contract is not something you can just pull off the shelf, even if it has a well-recognized name attached to it, one of the larger bodies. But why do these things still keep happening? Why do we have this constant vicious cycle of problems in contracting?
I wish I knew.
Okay.
I think it's basically laziness and getting out of your
All
comfort
right.
zone. Contract administration is not for sissies. It takes a
Right.
lot of effort.
Okay.
And I think people just get lazy, and we've done this before and before, so why do we need to have a contract? We know
Right.
what we're doing,
Okay.
which is fine.
Yes.
If everybody does what they should be doing, there's no problem.
Right.
The problem really is when things go wrong. And there's some wag said the other day, you have a marriage contract, not for getting married, you've got a marriage contract to sort out the mess when you want to get divorced.
Exactly.
And the same really applies to building contracts.
Right. Excellent. Okay. Great, Uwe. Thank you so much for your time.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
This is Alistair Curry for CPD On Demand.